As the day in the United States of America ends and India wakes up, the Prime Minister has addressed the US Congress and also held a joint press conference with American President Joe Biden. I'm Barkha Dutt, you're with the Mojo story. Our special continued coverage of the Prime Minister's trip to the United States continues. For the second time, the Prime Minister has addressed the US Congress. There were those who counted and said there were 12 standing ovations. In a speech that referenced Indian Americans repeatedly, the Prime Minister, of course, has been making headlines in Washington, where he is a state guest of the Biden administration, only the third to be hosted in this manner by the Biden administration. The previous two were leaders of France and South Korea. At a rare joint press conference, the Prime Minister and the American President were asked questions, included questions on the rights of Muslims in India, as well as the larger democracy debate. Both President Biden and Prime Minister Modi responded to those questions, even as former President Barack Obama literally set the cat among the pigeons with his statement on the rights of religious minorities in India to Christian Amanpour. So a lot to unpack in this special broadcast as we look at what has happened while India has been asleep and America certainly has been awake. The images you're seeing are of the Prime Minister delivering for the second time an address to the US Congress, in which members of Congress repeatedly sprang to their feet, as you can see in those images, to give Prime Minister Modi a standing ovation, even as media in the United States of America seem to be in an almost parallel universe, writing critical op-eds, pushing the Biden administration to raise some tricky questions with Prime Minister Modi. As I said, let's introduce our guests on the program today. Let me first welcome to the program Akriti Kalyankar. She's a fellow at the Stimson Center. It's good to see you, Akriti. Also welcoming tonight in the US, morning in India, is Chris Chivvis. He's a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment. It's good to see you, Chris. Also joining us from Brown University is Ashutosh Varshaney. Ashutosh is, of course, one of our best-known political scientists, but I think in this context, I should also say that he was among those who has been meeting and briefed by the State Department on the larger debate around democracy, one that raises hackles in India, but has certainly been discussed here in the United States. And also joining us is Seema Sirohi. Seema Sirohi is, of course, an author, a veteran foreign correspondent, and the author of Friends with Benefits, the India-US story. All right, I want to just, before I get first comments from all of you, just play out a few clips of the Prime Minister's speech to the US Congress. Remember, many Indians may have been asleep when this address was made. So first was the reference to Indian Americans, a success story, now nearly 5 million in number. Indian Americans found themselves referenced again and again in the Prime Minister's address, including to somebody, as Modi said, who was sitting right behind him. Listen in.
There are millions here who have roots in India. Some of them sit proudly in this chamber. And there is one behind me who had made history. I'm told that the Samosa caucus is now the flavor of the house.
The Samosa caucus is now the flavor of the house. It's a great quotable quote. Seema Sirohi, let me actually start with you. What was that one comment in this address to the Congress that really stood out for you? Seema?
I think, I don't know about one comment, but there were two things that the Congress was looking for, and both of which Modi delivered. One was, more the kind of language the Americans would like India to use on the war in Ukraine, and the coercive behavior of China. So both these things Modi spoke about. And then he was really ecstatic about the relationship itself. There were a lot of rhetorical flourishes that are quite memorable, Samosa Caucus being one of them. On democracy, uh, he kind of framed the whole thing in Vedas and things like that. Mother of India is the mother of democracy, etc. I think this debate on democracy has kind of been on one side of this visit, but a very small side, I would say. So, as you know, about 4 or 5 members of Congress boycotted this address, but a whole lot of them signed a letter to President Biden, asking the president to raise these issues in whichever form he felt necessary. Biden actually said something in his welcome address itself, indirectly. He talked about democracy in general and rule of law, freedom of press, etc. Then again, when they appeared for the press conference, there was another reference. There was another
Yeah.
reference before they had bilateral talks. Now, the question is this debate going to continue? Yes, it will. Because there's a segment of the intelligentsia, the strategic community that is very seized of this issue. But Modi's tactic has been to just not acknowledge that there is a problem. He's basically saying democracy is in the DNA of India. What you want, everybody, I'm delivering the goods to everyone, irrespective of religion, caste, or creed. So that's what I would say.
So it's very interesting. I thought we'd get to the democracy part of our conversation later, but in some ways, there have been these kind of parallel strands that have been running through this entire visit. And therefore, before further ado, let me just actually play out for you, Seema. You said that, the strategy of the Modi government has been to ignore it. But then you actually had a reporter from the Wall Street Journal get up at that joint press conference and put that question both to Biden, did you bring it up, and to Prime Minister Modi. And when she questioned Prime Minister Modi, this is what he said. Listen in.
Mr. Prime Minister, India has long prided itself as the world's largest democracy, but there are many human rights groups who say that your government has discriminated against religious minorities and sought to silence its critics. As you stand here in the east room of the White House, where so many world leaders have made commitments to protecting democracy, what steps are you and your government willing to take to improve the rights of Muslims and other minorities in your country and to uphold free speech?
मुझे आश्चर्य हो रहा है कि आप कह रहे हैं कि लोग कहते हैं नहीं, भारत डेमोक्रेसी है। और जैसा राष्ट्रपति बाइडेन ने कहा, भारत और अमेरिका दोनों के डीएनए में लोकतंत्र है। लोकतंत्र हमारा स्पिरिट है, लोकतंत्र हमारी रगों में है, लोकतंत्र को हम जीते हैं और हमारे पूर्वजों ने उसको शब्दों में ढाला है संविधान के रूप में। और हमारी सरकार लोकतंत्र के मूलभूत मूल्यों को आधार लेकर के बने हुए संविधान के आधार पर चलती है। और हमारा संविधान और हमारी सरकार, और हमने सिद्ध किया है डेमोक्रेसी कैन डिलीवर। और जब मैं डिलीवर कहता हूं तब कास्ट, क्रीड, रिलीजन, जेंडर, किसी भी भेदभाव को वहां जगह नहीं होती है। और जब हम लोकतंत्र की बात करते हैं तब अगर ह्यूमन वैल्यूज नहीं है, ह्यूमैनिटी नहीं है, ह्यूमन राइट्स नहीं है, फिर तो वो डेमोक्रेसी है ही नहीं। और इसलिए जब आप डेमोक्रेसी कहते हैं, जब डेमोक्रेसी को स्वीकार करते हैं और जब हम डेमोक्रेसी को लेकर के जीते हैं, तब डिस्क्रिमिनेशन का कोई सवाल ही नहीं उठता है। और इसलिए भारत सबका साथ, सबका विकास, सबका विश्वास, सबका प्रयास, उन मूलभूत सिद्धांतों को लेकर के, और इसलिए हम चलते हैं। भारत में सरकार के जो बेनिफिट्स हैं वो एक्सेस टू ऑल है, जो भी उसके हकदार हैं उन सबको मिलते हैं। इसलिए भारत के लोकतांत्रिक मूल्यों में कोई भेदभाव नहीं है, न धर्म के आधार पर, न जाति के आधार पर, न उम्र के आधार पर, न भूभाग के आधार पर।
There is no question of discrimination on the basis of religion, caste, or any other identity marker. I'm just summarizing this roughly. Democracy is in our DNA. We live and breathe it. I'm surprised that you would say people call India a democracy. India is a living, breathing democracy. Chris, I want to bring you in. I was talking about two parallel. There seem to be two parallel sort of narratives around this visit. What the Times and the Post are talking about, and what the Wall Street Journal gets up and asks the Prime Minister, and what the Biden administration is talking about, which is probably maybe some conversation about democracy, but mostly China, Ukraine, the Indian market, the purchase of drones, the transfer of technology. How do you see these two parallel tracks?
Well, I think one way of looking at it is that the Biden administration has decided that it wants to make a big bet on India because it sees the enormous potential of the relationship in material terms when it comes to defense, economics, technology, on the hope that, over time, the differences that, some people in Washington have with the Modi government in particular will fade, that this will be just one sort of ripple on the water of what could over time become a very deep and useful relationship both to the United States and to India. So that's my guess of what the strategy is here and the reasons why the administration has decided to speak softly about the issues that some parts of the Washington intelligentsia, as you put it, have been raising about minority rights and the state of democracy in India. Of course, I just add to that the fact that also I think people here recognize that American democracy is not perfect and that we have to be careful when we go about criticizing other countries. So it's best to do that as necessary, but to do it quietly rather than in a full-throated kind of way.
I'm glad you made that point because I think, a lot of Indians at a very basic level would have looked at the scenes at the Capitol on the 6th of January and said, hey, when elections are lost or won in our country, the transition to power is peaceful. And the winner says, yay, we won, but also says, well fought to the opponent. And so it's this democracy debate is a complex one. And Chris, I'm glad you've made the point that there has to be some inward reflection as well. But meanwhile, President Obama, and I want to remind everybody before I play out this clip from Christian Amanpour and come to you, Ashutosh, President Obama, who once profiled Prime Minister Modi as the great reformer of our time for Time magazine, there you see it. India's reformer-in-chief, this is Obama writing about Modi in Time in 2015, went on record with Amanpour talking about how India may even pull apart if the rights of Muslims and religious minorities were not addressed. Listen in.
If the president meets with Prime Minister Modi, then the protection of the Muslim minority in a majority Hindu India, that's something worth mentioning. Because, and by the way, if I had a conversation with Prime Minister Modi, who I know well, part of my argument would be that if you do not protect the rights of ethnic minorities in India, then there is a strong possibility India at some point starts pulling apart.
A very big, dramatic, much debated statement. Let me take that to you, Ashutosh. I know that you've been involved in some ways in this conversation. You're bound by Chatham House rules, so there's some things you can say, some things you can't say. But you're an Indian citizen who sort of lives and works in the United States of America. And when you see this democracy debate, how do you look at it? You just heard Chris saying America has to be careful before it steps out and lectures the rest of the world. And a lot of Indians may say, hey, listen, maybe we want to criticize the Modi government. Maybe we want them to do better on especially the question of Muslim representation and some of the sort of rhetoric, the hard Hindutva rhetoric. But do we want or need the Americans bringing this up? I want you to talk about this.
Well, that's a very big question. Let me first say that the democracy debate, at least from in the universities, which has, I think, influenced what's going on because of what we've written, many of us as political scientists looking at data and the various indexing agencies. The first thing to note is that India is an electoral democracy. Problem is not electoral. You can't have 13 state governments run by non-BJP parties out of 28. Nearly half of India's state governments are not under the control of BJP. That can't happen in an electoral autocracy. That's not, it simply makes no sense to not recognize that India is an electoral democracy. From the perspective of scholars beyond the Videm Institute, which is also full of scholars in Sweden, the real issue is democracy between the elections, not democracy at the time of elections. And there, India's declining performance on freedom of expression, freedom of association that we haven't yet covered, civil society. 17,000 civil society organizations have either been deregistered or their FCRA licenses have been withdrawn since 2014. 17,000, that is the latest count we have. It's more than that by now. This was late 22, by late 2022. So, and freedom of expression, more than 7,000 people have been arrested for under UAPA on grounds of either terrorism or sedition for just writing something. In one case, one journalist was picked up because in his backpack there was a book by Paul Barras, and the police mentions that. Paul Barras is a scholar who's hardly supported sedition. So freedom of association, freedom of expression, religious minorities, safeguards for religious minorities. These are the three issues that affect the functioning of Indian democracy between elections.
Should there be questions that are the business? And I'm being a little bit deliberately provocative here, but I'm asking a legitimate question. Is it the business of the United States of America?
So,
these are very legitimate questions. What do they have to do with Joe Biden? Many Indians may ask.
Now, America's democracy debate in the universities is not about freedom of expression as much. It is to some extent the cancel culture, etc., but not freedom of citizen expression outside the universities, not freedom of civil society, and not the between elections freedom of racial minorities. India's religious minorities don't play the same role in American political landscapes. Racial minorities. In America's problem, democracy problem, is the electoral process and the attempt in many Republican states to do what American political science calls voter suppression, making it hard for racial minorities to vote. By the way, electoral process is administered in many Republican states. It's not an America-wide issue. It is a problem in most, if not most, many Republican states, right?
I get that.
Yeah. So the American issue is exactly the opposite of India's. It's the vote which is being contested so heavily. Who can vote and what is legitimate vote? That is not the big issue in India as of now. Whether it becomes one later after CAA is implemented by states. 12 states have said they would not implement.
Got that. Yeah. Can I ask you something? And I want to get Seema to respond briefly before I go to Akriti and Chris. when you heard Obama say what he did, the same, and Seema, first to Ashu and then to you, and of course, everybody should come in on what Obama said. Do you think that it defined in some ways the visit, or do you think it was once again something happening in a corner of the media? Now, you can ignore the editorials of the Post and the Times, but can you ignore what Obama is saying? Ashu, first, you quickly.
A clear divergence is emerging in America between the non-governmental sector. At this point, Obama will have to be seen as part of the non-governmental sector, and the non-governmental discourse, and the governmental discourse. The governmental discourse is saying geostrategic primacy over democracy and minority rights and freedom of expression. Geostrategic primacy over democracy. And the non-governmental, Washington Post, New York Times, universities, and Obama, who's part of the non-governmental sector now, saying, well, minority rights, freedom of expression, we didn't talk about freedom of expression, we only talk about minority rights. They also matter, not simply geostrategic compulsions. So you have two different things emerging. I'm not talking about the private sector, which is not participating, private economic sector, corporate sector, which is not participating in this debate. It's New York Times, Washington Post, universities on the one hand, and the government on the other.
All right, let's open this up. It's a very interesting formulation. In the United States of America, the view or the gaze on India, there are two strands, the non-governmental and the governmental. I want to bring in Seema briefly, and sorry, Akriti, I made you wait, coming to you right after that, because Seema, I saw your tweets on Obama's statement, and you were neither amused nor impressed. Tell us why. Can we unmute Seema?
Firstly, as a former president, it's the last thing he should be doing by sort of commenting on a state visit in the midst of it, putting everything in such stark terms, almost predicting the breakup of India, Muslim India pulling away from Hindu India. I mean, no, I'm sorry, erudite as he is supposed to be. I was not impressed. And as you know, I'm no fan of either side. And I disagree with Professor Varshaney that the debate is not as stark. It is not such a clean divide that universities and NGOs, all the virtuous people are on one side and all the realists are on the other side. No, it's not like that. And to add one more point, the White House will not be pleased by this intervention because they put in a huge amount of effort in this whole visit, this whole substantive joint statement that has come out. They want to move the ship of this relationship in a certain direction that looks at the future. Yes, there are warts. Yes, there are difficulties. But this debate, I think I agree more with you. This debate has to happen in India. Professors and NGOs talk, or the New York Times editorial board, they're not the sort of deciders, to use George W. Bush's term. They're not the deciders of this. So I don't think President Obama, former President Obama, should have gone that far. And I can tell you that even the big letter that came from the senators and congressmen, it was heavily qualified with a long preamble at the beginning, which says, oh, this relationship is exactly what President Biden is trying to do with the relationship. We support that. Strategic cooperation, defense cooperation, jobs, all of that, trade, etc. Space.
You're basically saying Biden won't be happy with Obama.
No, and I know I've heard that from a few people that this White House doesn't like the former Obama officials always sort of saying where Biden is going wrong. It's not just
Yeah,
about
yeah, but let's pivot back. Let's pivot back to India. There's a lot to talk about Biden and what's happening with Biden. Biden finds himself in all kinds of political questions. His own son, of course, has been ensnared in the headlines this past week. He's also entering an election year. Akriti, the India question: what dominates? What is, what do you see as the centerpiece? Ashu might look at this and say, look, the centerpiece was we got everybody talking about Indian democracy, and therefore you cannot put that to the margins of the conversation. Seema and Chris may say, that's a conversation you guys in the media are having. The governments are having some completely different conversation. And Ashu is acknowledging that there's a government conversation and a non-government conversation that's going on here. Akriti.
I think that it's fair to have the values debate, and we've seen the airing of grievances on this issue a lot over the last few days. Both President Biden and Prime Minister Modi got asked a question about democracy, and I think President Biden actually did respond and say that he did raise the issue with Prime Minister Modi, and they both did discuss challenges to democracy. So I think at this point, we're in danger of moving away from the real message of the visit, to me at least, which is about not just shared values, it is about shared interests. We're kind of moving away from the shared interest aspect of the relationship, which to me was actually pretty stark in the speech that Prime Minister Modi gave to the joint session of Congress. I want to come back to what Seema was saying. I actually think a lot of the language on China, without specifically mentioning China, was pretty strong. I mean, the fact that Prime Minister Modi said the dark clouds of coercion and confrontation are coming over the Indo-Pacific, and that's the central issue of concern. And specifically raising the issue of debt trap diplomacy and using connectivity as strategic leverage. All of that is language that's definitely going to play well in the US, but it's also sort of the underlying strategic rationale of the US-India relationship. And I do want to come back to a lot of the substantive issues and outcomes that we've had in this visit. We're seeing a lot of movement on a lot of issues that were stuck for many years. We're seeing, for example, a US-India Indian Ocean dialogue. We are seeing that India is going to have 3 liaison officers at US command. So I think we kind of need to frame this visit in the context of where we're actually making progress. And I really do see it's absolutely fair to have a discussion about values, but we also should be talking about interests, and this visit is really about interests.
I think that's a really important point. I think it's a really important point to say, let's not lose track of the fact that at the heart of this conversation is a word called China, is another word called Ukraine, is also another word called Pakistan, is also another word called, the idea of transfer of technology. There's a lot else to talk about, but as happens in the media, because it's the media in some ways framing the conversation around the visit, I do want to just take another set of questions on Biden and how Biden might be looking at this relationship. And Chris, I'm going to come to you, but I want to play out the question that was posed to Biden. Did you or did you not have this conversation with Prime Minister Modi about shared values, about democracy, about rights? And this is what Biden said.
You raise these broader issues of human rights and democracy. What is your message to those, including some members of your own party, who believe that your administration is overlooking the targeting of religious minorities and a crackdown on dissent in India?
Well, look, the Prime Minister and I had a good discussion about democratic values, and that's the nature of our relationship. We're straightforward with each other, and we respect each other. One of the fundamental reasons that I believe the U.S.-China relationship is not in the space it is in the U.S.-Indian relationship is that there's an overwhelming respect for each other because we're both democracies. And it's a common democratic character of both our countries and our people, our diversity, our culture, our open, tolerant, robust debate. And I believe that we believe in the dignity of every citizen. And it is in America's DNA, and I believe in India's DNA, that the whole world has a stake in our success, both of us, in maintaining our democracies, makes us appealing partners, and enables us to expand democratic institutions around the world. And I believe this, and I still believe this.
Picking up from what Ashutosh Varshaney said, two different conversations, the government having a very different conversation than the media, than civil society, than professors in US colleges and universities. What are you focused on? You know, from your perch, when you heard the Prime Minister, were you looking for what he would say on democracy, or were you looking for what he'd say on Ukraine? Or are those two not mutually exclusive?
Well, they're definitely not mutually exclusive. I mean, but it is true that, you know, as someone who works on American statecraft, my focus is much more on the interests that the United States has in India, and the interests that India has in the United States. And that doesn't mean that we should ignore the question of values. And I think that it's interesting, the clip that you just played with President Biden. He seemed to be emphasizing that he really believes that, you know, at our core, India and the United States are both democracies. And the flip side of the coin is that that doesn't mean that we're perfect democracies, either of us. And he was trying to emphasize thereby the commonality of our two countries in terms of our political systems. I do hope that he raised, you know, values in a humble and effective way with the Prime Minister in their private meetings, because the risk, of course, of not doing that is that you set expectations that aren't going to be met. I mean, we have to be honest as much as we can, especially in private with each other, if we're going to realize any of the strategic potential in the relationship, which, you know, as you sort of suggested, is what my main interest is here. And you already noted that, you know, it just looms so large in Washington right now. This really is, I think, probably the main reason why you have extraordinary bipartisan support, not universal support, but very strong bipartisan support for this relationship.
But Chris, if I can, before I come to Ashutosh on that, if I can just say, even about China, the fact is that the Indians, and if you look at me, you know, this is something I argued in my own piece in Washington Post. India went from hosting a summit of the SCO foreign ministers, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, to the Quad. And it is not as if India is going to navigate its China relationship taking its cue from America. And likewise, you had Blinken in Beijing on the weekend, and then you had Biden calling Xi Jinping a dictator. The point I'm trying to make is, if China is the big factor, the X factor right now, even on China, it's not that India and the US, while having strategic convergence, are always going to have identical takes. Chris,
I couldn't agree more. And I read your op-ed. I thought it was, you know, right on point. I think, you know, people like my colleague at Carnegie, Ashley Tellis, have been pointing out that, you know, even though there is a geopolitical rationale for the US-India relationship, and we have good reason to be investing in the relationship, it doesn't mean that India is going to do our bidding at any particular point in time. It's certainly not going to, you know, contribute forces in the case of a Taiwan conflict, which is the thing that's most pressing here in Washington right now. We certainly will have differences, but we have differences even with our very closest allies. So that just because we're going to have differences doesn't mean that there's not a strategic rationale to underpin the relationship for many years.
here's a question for you, Ashutosh. The concerns about China, and absolutely, Chris, I mean, I think it's not going to be identical. I think India's never, we already have two examples from the past, Afghanistan, Iraq. India's never going to sign up, I think, as part of putting boots on the ground in somebody else's war. I don't see that happening. But my question is somewhat different. Given the concerns in Washington today about China, given those concerns, and given what's happening in Ukraine, and with American attention focused on these two big spaces, do you believe that this is what will steer the direction of this relationship? Do you agree with Seema that Biden and the Biden White House may be very irritated today with Obama for basically trying to change the headlines?
Well, I don't think the democracy debate says that India and United States should not come closer. I don't think that's the point. The 70 congressmen and senators who have signed that letter to Biden are not saying, and nor are the universities saying, that India and United States should not come closer. The China factor looms large. Absolutely. it's simply the point that this relationship would be deeper, better, and if we also sort out the democracy question. I don't think President Obama, former President Obama, is under an obligation to make it easier for Biden. There are some larger principles also that he believes in, and he expressed those principles very honestly in that interview with Christiane Amanpour. He's not the president. He's not running the show. He is also worried about. I don't think he doesn't. I don't think he's against India and United States coming closer. That's not the point. Also, please note, 70 people who have signed, I think, with the exception of one maybe, and not even one, are all Democrats. How many Democrats are in the Senate and the House? My calculation is 265. So 70 out of 265, that's a very large number. 70 out of 265 are saying these are, I think there may be one Republican there, I'm not sure. I think they're all Democrats. But they are saying that India and United States should come closer. It's a good thing that's happening. Nor are they non-governmental. Even the editorials in the New York Times and the Washington Post are not against India and United States coming closer. And some of the agreements that have been announced about investment, about defense collaboration, about energy, and also about the comments on Ukraine and global order and Pakistan. I don't think people are against that. It's just that this has to be deeper. And there is the deeper question is what's happening to democracy in India between elections, and what's happening to democracy in the Republican states of USA, right? Now, okay. So let me also add one more thing here. President Obama may, for what he said, may be disliked by President Biden today, but really that's not the point. The point is also what makes the relationship deeper, as I said, and that's what he addressed. Obama is not against India and United States coming closer. He's in favor of that.
Got it. Let's take comments from Seema and Akriti, and then we need to also shift gear and look at some of the other things that were said in the U.S. Congress. But Seema, do go ahead.
So, President Obama was very willing to deal with Modi when he wanted a bargain on climate change. Remember that? So this is all about doing things together, whatever can be done. And in practical terms, I don't know what the US Congress can do to make the government of India do a certain thing that they don't like, or Modi to do certain things that they want him to do. What in practical terms can they do except to use some sort of coercive tactic? India doesn't take any aid. Okay, so they can stop the GA engine deal from going through, but that hurts the US as well in terms of job. Today, President Biden talked about India buying those 200 Boeing planes, right? How that alone would support so many jobs in the US. It's all of that. I really don't know where this takes us. I think this battle has to be fought at home. It just makes everyone feel better over here, I think, especially members of Congress who increasingly, maybe I'm becoming a cynic having lived here too long, they do performance art, like they'll make this statement because some donor or some group is demanding that they make a statement, or certain amount of funding will stop, or some invitations to those donor rich dinners will stop. I mean, it's all very brutal out here. So I know it looks different from the outside, but Washington is a pretty politically brutal place.
Interesting and very cynical. Akriti, do you feel less cynical, or do you feel, Ashutosh, you're wanting to say something? Let me allow Ashutosh a brief
I don't
interjection.
understand. I really don't. I have a fundamental disagreement with Seema on this panel. I think if Seema is saying that Indian Americans are telling 70 senators and congressmen and congresswomen that they will stop funding them, giving them money if they don't issue a statement on democracy. I don't know where to find evidence for a claim like that. Indian Americans at this point would stop funding those senators and congressmen and women who appear to be saying things that Indians don't like or Modi doesn't like.
No,
Indian American category is very different here. Indian American money is not going to be stopped because Indian American money cannot generate 70 senators and congressmen and women saying you must pay attention to democracy. Indian American money saying don't pay attention to democracy.
Seema,
Go ahead.
Seema?
Just be closer.
Okay. Just to clarify, I think you misunderstood me completely. The money is not, I did not say it's coming from Indian Americans. I did not name the groups. It's obviously not coming from in many
Why do you simply not see this as an ideological battle? Why do you simply not see it as an ideological argument?
The money many times is coming from groups that they feel aggrieved. Muslim groups, an organization called CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations. These are very large groups. They're pan-national. They really have a lot of influence on the Congress. It's not... I think you misunderstood what I was saying.
Okay.
There are lots of groups in operation in Washington, D.C. with different agendas. Some of them are supported by, I would say, Pakistan even, ISI and things like that.
Okay, I think this is Ashutosh. Yeah, I know. You're going to take objection to that. One sentence and then Akriti. We've got to move on. We've got 10 minutes left. Ashutosh, one sentence. Ashu, do you want your sentence?
I think we should take arguments seriously, ideological battle seriously. Not everything is produced by money, though quite a lot is produced by money. But anyone who says that money is the reason this is happening should be able to produce some serious evidence for it. Otherwise, it's a straightforward ideological battle. This ideological battle does not mean that India and the United States should not come closer, and GE should not invest, and Micron should not invest, and drones should not be provided for intelligence. No, nothing of that sort. That's not the issue. The issue is what brings America and India into what brings them into a deeper dialogue and deeper relationship. That's what the issue is here.
Okay,
and that's an ideological battle.
Okay, now Akriti, the democracy demands that we give Akriti her say. Akriti, please do go ahead. Yes.
I think the only point I wanted to make, and maybe I'm going to sound the most cynical here, is I think we're in danger of overdoing this debate to the extent that it actually gives ammunition to those in India who say that there are, pockets of the US that are against the relationship, and that, this is very kind of one-sided criticism, because we haven't seen the Indian government really make any public comments about race relations in the US, for example, or there have been incidents of racially motivated attacks on Indian students in the past in the US, and there hasn't really been any official statements from India on that. So I think we do get into the danger of, overdoing this and making it seem from the Indian point like very one-sided. So I do think that's important to remember. But, I do want to come back to the broader discussion of, we should give some credit to the US government that when it is conceptualizing a relationship that it wants kind of in the long term, it is thinking and balancing these issues. But, when you do something like the GE and HAL, the joint, co-production of the jet engine, you are thinking about what are the threats in the future that you're going to face. How are you going to build the capabilities of partners? And there is, deep thinking done on that. And I think we should kind of move the discussion more to the strategic issues as well, because I just think we're sort of overdoing the values. But
I'm taking my cue from you, let me actually move to what was said about Ukraine. One of the sort of red flags for the Americans, though they've accepted the Indian position, is the refusal to condemn Russia outright, though the Indian position has been incrementally changing since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. the purchase of oil, for example, has been a big story in the Western media. The purchase of Russian oil by the Indians. It's an issue for the Americans. India will say, well, unblock oil from Iran, unblock oil from Venezuela. But first, let's listen to what the Prime Minister said about Ukraine in his address.
The last few years have seen deeply disruptive developments. With the Ukraine conflict, war has returned to Europe. It is causing great pain in the region. Since it involves major powers, the outcomes are severe. Countries of the global south have been particularly affected. The global order is based on the respect for the principle of the UN Charter, peaceful resolution of disputes, and respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. As I have said directly and publicly, this is not an era of war. But it is one of dialogue and diplomacy. And we all must do what we can to stop the bloodshed and human suffering.
All right, let's actually come get responses to that. Chris, that comment on Ukraine, it doesn't say the word Russia, but obviously it goes down well with the audience. How much of an irritant is India's very individualistic positioning on the Russian invasion?
Yeah, it's a really important question. I mean, I think at the outset of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the expectations in Washington were fairly high that India would take a very critical position on it, given the fact that this is, very much a war of Russian imperialism against Ukraine, and that India obviously has a history that it can lean on here in understanding the plight of the Ukrainian people. So I think that there was some surprise, but as time has gone by, I think that there's been a growing realism about the position that India is in, both in terms of its economic interests in maintaining a relationship with Russia, and then obviously the longstanding defense relationship. Obviously, tensions over India's defense relationship with Russia predate this conflict. The S-400 being something that loomed large in the relationship for years beforehand. So I think there's greater realism now, and a recognition that while India's relationship with Russia on defense especially will be a constraint on the ability of the United States to deepen the relationship, it's not a deal breaker. And that, again, as I said before...
What would be a deal breaker? What would be a deal breaker? Would there be any deal breaker? Is there a deal breaker?
I think, in terms of a specific event, I mean, well, you can imagine all kinds of different, crazy scenarios, and I don't think we want to do that here. But I mean, I think it's the question of the test of time. Do the promises that have been made today in Washington pay off 3, 5, and 10 years from now, or is there sort of a frustration and disillusionment with the high expectations that have been raised through this visit?
Akriti, you've been wanting to talk strategy. Ukraine, China, apart from the transfer of technology, is literally where it's at. Do you believe the China factor now determines the future of the Indo-US relationship to a large degree in the immediate future? I am not taking away from the fact that there is a long-term sort of historic deepening. It started in the Manmohan Singh age. It has been deepened in the Modi age. So, but taking the short-term view, is it the China factor? Even more than Ukraine, Russia?
I do think it's a bit of both. So just to respond to, the bite that you played, I do think it was actually really significant for Prime Minister Modi to say what he said during the address, because he's speaking to an American audience very clearly about Russia without saying Russia. He says I'm directly and publicly saying this is not an era of war. I think, I know it's sometimes frustrating that Indian foreign policy is like sometimes what's not said is as important as what's said, but I think there's an understanding in the US that this very clearly means that it's kind of an emphatic criticism of Russia and the situation, saying, that this is not an era of war and we are on the side of diplomacy and dialogue. And I do want to say that India's reliance on Russian defense equipment that concern has actually been an accelerant for the US-India relationship, particularly what we've seen in the last few months on the critical and emerging technology or the defense co-production side. I think there isn't a lot of interest in the US on wanting to reduce that dependence, but I also think there is an interest for India to do that as well. I think over time, India has realized that it cannot be so dependent on any one country. We've seen India actually reducing its dependence on Russian weapons because of cost overruns, because of delays. That's why it's diversifying away to other partners. But I think the first time the US is actually stepping up in very significant ways to do a tech transfer and really show, okay, we are serious about building your capabilities in helping your military modernization. So I do think it is, Russia's kind of been an accelerant, but in terms of the short to medium term or even long term future, obviously the strategic rationale behind the US-India relationship is China. There is growing convergence about Chinese coercion, in the Indo-Pacific, in how it impacts India's neighbors. Obviously, India's own border standoff with China as well. And I think a lot of the outcomes that you're seeing from this visit point to that, right? Whether it's the buying of the MQ-9 drones, which is obviously going to be used for surveillance and probably China-specific missions, the dialogue on the Indian Ocean, a lot of the conversations on the maritime security aspect, a lot of it is actually pointing to thinking about what competition with China is going to look like and what capabilities does India need from the US or other partners.
Yeah. Very, very interesting. But before I start taking closing comments, just want to play out a little clip that captures, in a sense, the mood of the moment as the toast was being raised at that state banquet, at that state dinner, and then we'll take last comments. Listen in.
And he used to say that when you give a toast and you don't have any alcohol in your glass, you must do it with your left hand. You think I'm kidding? I'm not.
प्रधानमंत्री जी, आप हमें हमारे कैमरोस थे जो उन्होंने कहा था कि अगर आप शराब नहीं पीते हैं तो आप बाएं हाथ से अपना ग्लास उठाएं, और मुझे लगा था हमारे पास पहले कोई ग्लास नहीं थे, लेकिन उन्होंने बताया कि इसमें जिंजर एल है.
Toast to our partnership, to our people, to the possibilities that lie ahead, to two great friends, two great nations, and two great powers. Cheers.
प्रधानमंत्री जी, आपकी साझेदारी के लिए धन्यवाद. आप सभी को मेरा अनुरोध है कि आप सब अपना ग्लास उठाएं और मेरे साथ.
All right, it's nice to have some humor at the end of ideological battles, strategic geopolitics, all the rest of it. Let's take last comments. What do we, in a way, walk away from when we look at what's happened in the last 3 days? I will start with you, Chris. What's the image or the quote or the statement that stays with you?
Well, I mean, I think it's, overall the day has the feel of a potentially historic visit. I mean, the breadth of issues that have been put on the table, the possibilities for future cooperation is very, very meaningful. But of course, who knows whether or not any of this potential will be realized. So really, only time will tell whether or not this was a turning point in U.S.-India relations. We'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, let me bring in Akriti quickly. Yeah, Seema, we're closing just in the last couple of minutes. Akriti, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll echo Chris to say that it definitely seems like both sides are making a long-term investment in the relationship in every really field of cooperation that you can think of, from technology to defense to climate to health to education. And in some ways, I think it's because, both sides are invested in trying to continue the momentum of the relationship into future generations. But I do think, the devil is in the details, and there are a lot of details of this visit that we all need to pass through. There's lots of outcomes and deliverables, and hopefully we will move towards implementation in the next few months and years.
Ashu?
I agree with the previous two speakers. There is an intimation of a historical turn here. Whether that will happen, we have to see. But the China point I have not spoken about. I wrote to you, Barkha, about it. There is a lot of long-term thinking that has gone into this visit and the document, the joint statement that has come out. But the trigger is China, and let me put it somewhat differently. Between 1996 and 2016. The central assumption of America's China policy was that greater global economic integration of China would lead to liberalization of the polity, and China will become less of its past and more like us. Not exactly like us, more like us. Under Trump, that assumption was dropped, and you can say that was Republicans dropping the assumption. Under Biden, now the Democrats have dropped that assumption. And this is a sea change. And India is one of the biggest beneficiaries of that, though this moment, this anti-China moment and anti-China bipartisan moment in American politics has led to some very long-term thinking on the part of American decision makers. And today was a very good example of that.
Yes, that is a very, very compelling point. The bipartisan anti-China movement, I think Chris made a reference to it as well earlier. Seema, let's bring you in on an overview as we close this broadcast. Let me ask you this. What has worked and what's still a major irritant? What's got better and what's still pretty much stuck where it was?
I look at the visit as a very successful one. The US and India are putting together an agenda that is more substantive than seen before. There's more ambition in it, and it could be what people have called, President Biden included, transformative in the relationship. One point I would like to add, that with the negotiations and what you see in the joint statement, you can see the relationship is changing to one of equals, more equal than before. Even the democracy debate, even the human rights debate, is Americans no longer talking sort of down to India in that sense, or telling this is what we need. Now it's a negotiation on every issue. And it's the realist element in the US foreign policy that has brought us to this moment. So I was speaking to a few Indian officials, and I was asking them that the Americans have been so effusive and have been briefing so often about this upcoming visit, while India has been more quiet, let's say. There was one thing ahead of the Prime Minister's visit. I was struck by that. So, I mean, the impression I got, it was rather interesting, is that we've been talking like this forever. Okay, so now America has kind of, woken up. I don't think it was quite that. He was being a bit joking.
I think that's an important point, that everything is a negotiation, but it's a negotiation between near equals, if not completely equal.
Right.
Then it's a little bit more, or certainly significantly more equal than before. I just want to say in the end that it has been rare to do a program on Indo-US relations and not mention Pakistan. Pakistan is mentioned, by the way. Concerns about cross-border terrorism and does find a reference in the joint statement, including a calling out of terror groups, including the Lashkar and the Jaish, that clearly have the patronage of the Pakistan deep state. You can see that in the joint statement. But the fact that even all of us spent such little time on it, this would not have happened a few years ago even, Seema. I mean, I remember when Obama was president, and that's all the media focused on, that Obama said Lashkar is a terror group and the support should end it. So things are shifting. And they may be shifting because of what Ashu just called the bipartisan anti-China movement. But there's also a bipartisan movement in India when it comes to, I'm not going to use the word pivot, but getting closer with the United States of America. And there's also a lot of bipartisanship in the Indian foreign policy where the Congress and the BJP agree on nothing, but they actually agree on the right of India to take its own position on Russia. So I just wanted to actually underline that as we close. Thank you very much. Lots to talk about, not enough time ever, but I think we started a conversation somewhere. Chris, Akriti, Ashutosh, Seema, I know it's late for you. We've got to let you all go and get some dinner and some rest. India's just waking up, and we'll be parsing through a lot of the material and have all of you back very soon. Thank you and take care.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.